The bright studio lights of The View cast a harsh glow across the set as the cameras rolled, capturing the 5 female hosts seated around their iconic table, and their guest, Jonathan Roumie, the actor known worldwide for Truth Love Jesus in the hit series The Chosen. The audience buzzed with anticipation, many having come specifically to see the man whose portrayal of Christ had touched millions of hearts across the globe. What should have been a standard celebrity interview was about to become something far more profound, a moment that would ripple through social media and leave viewers questioning their own assumptions about faith, humility, and grace under pressure. Joy Behar leaned forward in her seat, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes fixed firmly on her face as she prepared to address their guest. "So, Jonathan," she began, her voice carrying that distinctive tone that regular viewers recognized as the prelude to a provocative question. "You play Jesus, a Middle Eastern Jewish man, which is refreshingly accurate casting compared to the blonde, blue-eyed Jesus we've seen for decades." The comment was delivered with just enough edge to make her intention clear. This wasn't merely an observation about casting, but the beginning of what she hoped would be a politically charged discussion. Jonathan Roumie nodded politely, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the tension subtly building in the studio. The other hosts, Whoopi Goldberg, Sunny Hostin, Sarah Haynes, and Alyssa Farah Griffin, shifted almost imperceptibly in their seats, some perhaps anticipating the direction Joy was taking the conversation, others possibly hoping to steer it towards safer waters. No one yet realized that the next few minutes would transform a routine promotional appearance into a powerful testimony that would leave the studio audience on their feet. What Joy Behar said next was intended to corner Jonathan, to force him to either denounce certain expressions of Christianity or defend what she considered indefensible. Instead, his response would leave her momentarily speechless, the audience captivated, and millions of viewers reaching for their phones to share what they just witnessed. This is the remarkable story of what happened when mockery met grace, when cynicism encountered genuine faith, and how one man's unwavering compassion created an unexpected moment of truth on daytime television. Have you ever witnessed someone respond to criticism with such genuine grace that it transformed the entire conversation? This is exactly what happened when Jonathan Roumie, star of The Chosen, appeared on The View and faced pointed questions about his faith. His response didn't just silence his critics, it opened hearts and minds in ways no one expected. Earlier that morning, Jonathan Roumie had prepared for his appearance on The View with a simple prayer, something that had become a daily ritual since landing the role that changed his life. "Lord, let me be your instrument today," he whispered as he sat in the quiet of his hotel room. He knew the show's reputation for controversial discussions and politically charged debates, particularly when it came to matters of faith. The past few years had been a whirlwind for Jonathan, from facing financial ruin and contemplating leaving acting altogether to becoming the face of the most successful crowd-funded series in history. The Chosen had not only revitalized his career, but had deepened his own faith journey in ways he could never have anticipated. The responsibility of portraying Jesus weighed on him daily, influencing how he conducted himself both on and off screen. As he was led through the backstage corridors of the View studio, Jonathan could hear the hosts discussing the political news of the day, their animated voices carrying through the thin walls. A production assistant offered him water and reminded him of the talking points they hoped to cover: the show's success, his unexpected path to the role, and how viewers had responded to this unique portrayal of Jesus. Nothing in that briefing had prepared him for what was about to unfold. The segment began pleasantly enough with a clip from The Chosen, showing Jesus confronting the Pharisees about their obsession with rules while neglecting justice and mercy. The audience applauded as the clip ended, many nodding in appreciation of the powerful scene. Whoopi Goldberg introduced Jonathan with genuine warmth, mentioning the show's remarkable 600 million views and its status as the most successful crowd-funded series in television history. "Welcome to The View, Jonathan," Whoopi said with a smile. "I've got to say, this show has caught on like wildfire, and I understand why. It makes these biblical characters feel like real people with real problems." Jonathan thanked her sincerely, his humility evident as he deflected credit to the show's creator, Dallas Jenkins, and the talented writing team who had brought these ancient stories to life in such a relatable way. Sarah Haynes jumped in with a light-hearted question about whether people confused him with Jesus in real life, allowing Jonathan to share a few amusing anecdotes about fans who seemed to blur the lines between actor and character. "I try to gently remind people that my name is Jonathan, not Jesus," he chuckled. "And no, I can't hear their confessions, that's what priests are for." The audience laughed appreciatively, the atmosphere warm and engaging. Sunny Hostin, who had previously mentioned her Catholic faith on the show, leaned forward with genuine interest. "My family and I have been watching The Chosen, and what strikes me is how human Jesus feels. He laughs, he dances, he has real friendships." Her comment opened the door for Jonathan to explain the show's approach to portraying Christ as both fully divine and fully human, a theological concept that the series had brought to life in unprecedented ways. It was then that Joy Behar decided to shift the conversation in a more provocative direction. "You know, Jonathan," she began, her tone changing subtly, "I find it interesting that you're part of this faith-based phenomenon when religion, particularly Christianity, has become so politicized in America." She paused for effect, the studio growing quieter as the audience sensed the shift. "How do you reconcile portraying a Jesus who clearly stood for the poor and marginalized when so many loud Christian voices today seem to stand for the opposite?" The question hung in the air, its intent clear to everyone in the studio. This wasn't simply an inquiry about acting choices. It was a challenge designed to either force Jonathan to criticize certain expressions of Christianity or defend positions that would be unpopular with the views, largely progressive audience. The other hosts exchanged glances, perhaps wondering if this would devolve into yet another contentious moment in the show's history. Jonathan took a moment before responding, a brief pause that seemed to center him. "That's actually a profound question, Joy," he said, his voice calm and thoughtful, rather than defensive or agitated. "What drew me to this role, beyond the incredible opportunity as an actor, was the chance to portray the Jesus I encounter in the Gospels, who consistently stood against religious hypocrisy while showing radical love to those society rejected." He leaned forward slightly, his expression earnest as he continued. "In the clip we just saw, Jesus is confronting religious leaders who had turned faith into a set of rigid rules rather than a path to loving God and loving others." The studio remained silent, the audience and hosts alike caught by his sincerity. That challenge, to live authentic faith rather than performative religion, is as relevant today as it was 2,000 years ago, and it challenges me personally every single day. Joy seemed momentarily taken aback by the thoughtfulness of his response, having perhaps expected either defensiveness or platitudes. "But don't you think," she pressed, her voice taking on a slightly mocking edge, "that Christianity in America has become more about political power than actually following Jesus' teachings?" She gestured broadly with her hands. "I mean, the Jesus you play heals the sick for free, yet many Christians oppose universal health care." Attention rippled through the studio, some audience members shifting uncomfortably in their seats, while others nodded in agreement with Joy's characterization. Whoopi glanced at the producers off-camera, perhaps concerned about where this increasingly pointed exchange might lead. Jonathan remained composed, though a subtle shift in his posture suggested he recognized the gravity of the moment. "I can't speak for all Christians," Jonathan began carefully, "just as I wouldn't want someone to speak for all atheists or all Muslims or all of any group." His voice remained gentle but carried a new firmness. "What I can say is that Jesus consistently challenges all of us, myself included, to examine where our actions don't align with our stated beliefs." He paused briefly, meeting Joy's gaze directly. The Gospels are full of moments where Jesus upset the religious and political establishments of his day by pointing out exactly this kind of inconsistency. Joy seemed prepared to interrupt, but Jonathan continued with respectful confidence. "The beautiful thing about Jesus is that he offered this challenge not with condemnation, but with an invitation to something better." His expression softened further. He didn't mock those who failed to live up to their ideals. He invited them to return to the heart of faith, love of God, and love of neighbor. The subtle emphasis on mock wasn't lost on the audience or on Joy herself, whose expression flickered with the recognition that her approach had been gently but effectively called out. Sunny Hostin nodded appreciatively, while Sarah Haynes looked thoughtfully at Jonathan, clearly moved by his response. Even Whoopi seemed impressed by his ability to address the challenging question without either avoiding it or becoming combative. Joy, however, wasn't quite ready to let the subject drop. "But don't you think it's hypocritical?" she continued, her tone growing more explicitly sarcastic, "for people to worship someone who said, 'Sell all you have and give to the poor,' while they're driving luxury cars and living in mansions?" She looked around at the audience as if expecting their support. "I mean, if Christians actually followed Jesus' teachings, wouldn't our society look completely different?" A few audience members made sounds of agreement, but many more remained silent, watching Jonathan with interest to see how he would respond to this increasingly direct challenge. The other hosts seemed uncertain whether to intervene, with Alyssa Farah Griffin opening her mouth as if to speak, but then closing it again, allowing Jonathan to address Joy's question himself. "You know, Joy," Jonathan said after taking a deep breath, "before I landed the role in The Chosen, I was completely broke." His candor seemed to surprise Joy, whose eyebrows raised slightly. "I had run out of money, run out of food, even run out of government assistance." The studio grew utterly silent as he continued. "I tried everything I could think of to save my acting career, drove rideshare, worked catering, but nothing was working." Jonathan leaned forward, his voice growing more passionate but never losing its gentleness. "It was at that lowest point, about 6 years ago, when I finally got on my knees and surrendered everything to God, my career, my pride, my future." He shook his head slightly, as if still amazed by what happened next. "That very day I received an unexpected financial miracle that changed my life, and 3 months later I was cast as Jesus in The Chosen." The vulnerability of his testimony created a palpable shift in the studio's atmosphere. Even Joy's expression had softened, her planned follow-up comment apparently forgotten as she listened to this raw account of faith amid struggle. The audience, many visibly moved, remained completely focused on Jonathan's words. "So when you ask about hypocrisy," Jonathan continued, his voice gentle but unwavering, "I understand the question. I've asked it myself many times." He made eye contact with Joy directly. "But I've also experienced the incredible grace that comes when we acknowledge our own failures and hypocrisies, instead of just pointing out others." His smile carried no judgment, only compassion. "That's actually what first drew me to Jesus, not his condemnation of wrong, but his compassion for the wrongdoer." The studio remained silent for a moment after he finished speaking. It wasn't the awkward silence of a conversation gone wrong, but the profound quiet that follows when something unexpectedly authentic breaks through the usual talk show banter. Several audience members could be seen wiping away tears, moved by both the content of Jonathan's testimony and the grace with which he had responded to Joy's provocative questions. Whoopi Goldberg, sensing the powerful moment unfolding, stepped in with evident respect. "You know, Jonathan, what strikes me about your portrayal of Jesus is the humanity you bring to him." Her usually boisterous tone had softened considerably. "He's not just this perfect figure floating above everyone else's problems. He gets tired, he laughs with his friends, he experiences real emotions." Jonathan nodded appreciatively at Whoopi's observation, clearly grateful for the thoughtful engagement. "That was so important to Dallas Jenkins, our creator, and to all of us on the show," he explained. "The Jesus of the Gospels is described as being fully human as well as fully divine. He experienced everything we experience, except sin." His passion for the subject was evident in how he leaned forward slightly. "That's what makes him so relatable. He understands our struggles from the inside, not just from a distance." Joy had been unusually quiet since Jonathan's personal testimony, her expression suggesting she was processing his words. When she finally spoke again, her tone had notably changed. "So you literally went from being unable to feed yourself to playing Jesus in this huge hit show?" she asked, genuine curiosity having replaced the earlier mockery. That's quite a turnaround story. It absolutely is, Jonathan confirmed with a humble nod. And that's why I can never judge anyone who's struggling, because I've been there myself. He glanced around at all the hosts before continuing. One thing playing Jesus has taught me is that everyone is fighting battles we know nothing about, and we all need grace more than judgment. The audience burst into spontaneous applause at this statement, many rising to their feet in appreciation of Jonathan's wisdom and humility. The camera panned across their faces, capturing expressions of admiration and emotional connection that went far beyond the typical talk show response. Even the show's producers, visible at the edges of the set, appeared moved by the unexpected depth of the conversation. Sarah Haynes, who had been listening intently, joined the conversation with a thoughtful question. Jonathan, one thing I've noticed about The Chosen is how diverse the cast is. The disciples come from different backgrounds. There are people of color throughout. She smiled warmly. Was that a deliberate choice to make the show more inclusive, or was it aiming for historical accuracy? Jonathan brightened at the question, clearly appreciative of the chance to discuss this aspect of the show. It's actually both, he explained enthusiastically. Historically, Galilee was at the crossroads of major trade routes. It would have been incredibly diverse with people from all over the known world passing through. He gestured expressively as he continued, but it also reflects Dallas's vision that this story belongs to everyone, regardless of background, because Jesus came for all people. Sunny Hostin nodded in agreement. As someone who attends a Black Catholic church, I really appreciate seeing that diversity represented, she said. Growing up, I always saw the blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus in paintings and statues, but now our church shows him as brown-skinned, which is much more historically accurate. Joy, who had been uncharacteristically reflective for the past few minutes, seemed to decide it was time to reassert her skeptical persona. But let's be honest, she interjected, her voice taking on its earlier edge. Doesn't religion divide more than it unites? I mean, look at all the conflicts in the world caused by religious differences. She glanced around as if seeking agreement. Wouldn't we be better off without all these different groups claiming they have the exclusive truth? The other hosts exchanged concerned glances, perhaps worried that the beautiful moment that had been unfolding might now dissolve into controversy. Jonathan, however, didn't appear flustered by this return to challenging questions. If anything, he seemed to welcome the opportunity for genuine dialogue on difficult topics. That's a fair question, Jonathan acknowledged, showing no sign of offense. When religion becomes about power, control, or self-righteousness, it absolutely can divide and harm. Jesus himself was harshest with religious hypocrites who used faith to elevate themselves and oppress others. He paused thoughtfully before continuing. But authentic faith, centered on love and humility, has also inspired some of history's greatest movements for justice, compassion, and human dignity. He leaned forward slightly, set his expression earnest but never preachy. Martin Luther King Jr. was driven by his Christian faith to fight for civil rights. Mother Teresa was motivated by her Catholic faith to serve the poorest of the poor in Calcutta. His voice grew passionate but remained gentle. The first hospitals, many universities, countless charitable organizations all grew from people whose faith compelled them to love and serve others. The studio had grown completely silent again, the audience captivated by Jonathan's thoughtful response to what had clearly been intended as a gotcha question. Joy herself appeared somewhat taken aback, having perhaps expected either defensiveness or platitudes, rather than this nuanced reflection that acknowledged both the potential harms and benefits of religious belief. The Jesus I portray in The Chosen, the Jesus I encounter in the Gospels, consistently challenged religious institutions when they lost sight of what matters most: love of God and love of neighbor. Jonathan continued, his calm conviction filling the studio. That's the kind of faith I aspire to, even though I fall short every day. Not religion as a weapon or a dividing line, but faith as a call to love others as we've been loved. Spontaneous applause broke out again, with several audience members rising to their feet. The camera caught Joy's expression, a mixture of surprise and something that might have been reluctant respect. She had come prepared to challenge a religious actor with pointed questions, only to find herself engaged in a conversation of unexpected depth and authenticity. Roumie, recognizing the powerful moment unfolding, decided to build on it rather than pivot away. "You know, one thing I've always respected about Jesus, even as someone who doesn't identify as Christian, is his focus on actions over words," she reflected. He was always calling out people who talked a good game but didn't back it up with how they lived. Jonathan nodded enthusiastically, clearly appreciating Roumie's insight. "Absolutely. There's this powerful moment in the Gospels where Jesus says, 'Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father.'" His expression grew more earnest. "That challenges me daily. Am I just talking about faith, or am I actually living it through how I treat others?" The conversation had transcended the usual celebrity interview format, evolving into something more akin to a meaningful dialogue about faith, authenticity, and living one's values. Even the show's producers, visible at the edges of the set, appeared surprised by the direction the segment had taken, with one checking her watch and then making a quick gesture that suggested they should let this unusual moment continue to unfold. Joy, however, seemed determined to have the last word on her own terms. "Well, I still think organized religion has done more harm than good throughout history," she stated flatly, her tone suggesting she was making an obvious point that couldn't reasonably be disputed. "But I'll admit, your Jesus seems better than the one some politicians talk about." The comment was clearly intended to conclude the faith discussion on her terms, establishing her skeptical position as the reasonable one. While making a final political jab, several audience members shifted uncomfortably, perhaps sensing the return to the show's more typical combative approach after the surprisingly meaningful exchange they'd just witnessed. Jonathan could have let the comment pass, allowing the segment to end with Joy's skepticism as the final word. Instead, he responded with a gentleness that somehow made his words more powerful rather than less. "You know, Joy, one thing I've learned from portraying Jesus is that he never forced anyone to agree with him." His smile held genuine warmth without a trace of condescension. He simply invited people to come and see for themselves. He maintained direct but kind eye contact with Joy as he continued, "Whatever your experience with religion has been, good or bad, I'd just invite you and everyone watching to encounter Jesus directly through the Gospels with fresh eyes." His voice carried no pressure, only a sincere invitation. "You might be surprised by what you find there, just as I continually am after years of studying his words and actions for this role." The studio fell completely silent, Joy seemingly caught off guard by this gentle but powerful response. Rather than arguing or dismissing her perspective, Jonathan had acknowledged it while extending a respectful invitation to reconsider. The approach left no room for the typical back-and-forth debate format that often characterized discussions of religion on the show. After a moment of silence that felt significant rather than awkward, Roumie stepped in to wrap up the segment. "I'd say that's an invitation worth considering," she remarked with evident respect. "Jonathan Roumie, thank you for joining us today and for the meaningful conversation." Her tone conveyed genuine appreciation rather than the merely polite conclusion of a standard interview. As the audience erupted into enthusiastic applause, many rising to their feet, the camera caught Joy's expression, a mixture of surprise and something that might have been reluctant respect. She had come prepared to challenge a religious actor with pointed questions, only to find herself engaged in a conversation of unexpected depth and authenticity. The segment ended with Jonathan smiling warmly at all 5 hosts, including Joy, with no hint of triumph or resentment in his expression, only genuine goodwill. As the show cut to commercial, viewers at home were left with the powerful image of a man who had responded to skepticism and mockery, not with defensiveness or counterattack, but with the same grace and compassion that characterized the Jesus he portrayed on screen. Behind the scenes, as the commercial break began, the energy on set remained charged with the unusual encounter that had just unfolded. Crew members exchanged glances, clearly aware they had just witnessed something rare in daytime television, a conversation about faith that had transcended the usual talking points and political positioning to touch on something more profound. Jonathan stood to thank each of the hosts as they prepared to transition to the next segment. When he reached Joy, there was a brief moment of tension. Would she maintain her skeptical distance or acknowledge the unexpected connection that had formed despite her challenging questions? To the surprise of many watching backstage, Joy extended her hand with what appeared to be genuine respect. "That was not what I expected," she admitted with uncharacteristic candor, keeping her voice low enough that only those nearby could hear. "You didn't take the bait on any of my questions." There was a hint of something like admiration in her tone, professional respect from one skilled communicator to another who had refused to be drawn into the typical pattern of confrontation. Jonathan shook her hand warmly, his smile reflecting the same grace that had characterized his on-air responses. "I appreciated your questions, Joy," he replied sincerely. "They're important ones that deserve thoughtful engagement, not just defensive reactions." His response carried no hint of having won an exchange or bested an opponent, only genuine appreciation for the conversation, challenging though it had been. Whoopi approached as a production assistant was removing Jonathan's microphone. "That was something special," she said with her characteristic directness. "We have plenty of people come on this show to talk about faith, but few who actually demonstrate it the way you just did." Her eyes held a wisdom that came from decades in an industry known for its superficiality. "There's a difference, and it didn't go unnoticed." As Jonathan was escorted from the set, several audience members approached the barriers, calling out thanks and appreciation. One woman was visibly emotional as she called, "Thank you for standing firm in your faith." Another added, "Your Jesus would be proud of how you handled that." The spontaneous outpouring reflected how deeply the exchange had resonated with many watching. In the green room, Jonathan took a moment alone before his next media obligation. He closed his eyes briefly in a silent prayer of gratitude, aware that the conversation had gone in directions he couldn't have anticipated or prepared for. When a production assistant arrived to escort him to his waiting car, she mentioned that his segment was already generating significant buzz on social media. "People are saying it's the most authentic discussion of faith they've ever seen on daytime TV," she told him with evident admiration. "My phone's been blowing up with friends who were watching." She hesitated, then added more personally, "I'm not particularly religious myself, but what you said about Jesus inviting people rather than forcing them, that really made me think." Jonathan thanked her sincerely, once again deflecting praise in a way that suggested his responses on the show hadn't been a performance, but a genuine reflection of his character. As he was led through the backstage corridors toward the exit, several crew members nodded or smiled in a way that conveyed something beyond the usual professional courtesy extended to guests. Meanwhile, back on set, the hosts were preparing for their next segment, but the atmosphere had noticeably shifted. Sarah Haynes leaned towards Sunny Hostin during a touch-up from the makeup team. "That was really something, wasn't it?" she whispered. "I've never seen Joy almost speechless before." Sunny nodded in agreement, keeping her voice equally low. "It reminded me why I love The Chosen so much. It presents faith as something real and relevant, not just a set of rules or political positions." She glanced toward Joy, who was unusually quiet as she reviewed her notes for the next segment. I think even Joy was moved, though she'd never admit it. By the time The View finished taping that day, clips from Jonathan's appearance were already circulating widely online. Social media platforms filled with comments from viewers impressed by his gracious responses to challenging questions. "This is what living your faith actually looks like," one viral comment read. "No defensiveness, no culture war rhetoric, just genuine compassion and wisdom." Another widely shared post came from a self-described atheist. "I've always found religious people preachy or defensive when their beliefs are questioned, but Jonathan Roumie just showed a completely different approach. He listened, acknowledged criticisms of religion, and responded with respect instead of judgment. More conversations like this, please." That evening, Jonathan received a message from Dallas Jenkins, the creator of The Chosen, who had watched the segment online. "Brother, What a powerful witness today, the message read. Not because you won an argument or defended the faith with clever words, but because you embodied the Jesus we're trying to portray, meeting skepticism with compassion and criticism with grace. This is exactly why God put you in this role. The following morning's news coverage included numerous articles analyzing the unusual exchange. Entertainment reporters accustomed to covering celebrity appearances as light human interest stories found themselves writing about deeper themes of faith, authenticity, and civil dialogue across ideological differences. One headline read, "Jonathan Roumie turns contentious interview into powerful testimony on The View." A faith-based news outlet published a piece titled, "How to Respond to Critics: Lessons from Jonathan Roumie's Appearance on The View," analyzing how his approach had differed from the defensive posture often adopted by religious figures in mainstream media. Rather than treating Joy Behar as an opponent to be defeated, Roumie engaged with her as a person to be respected, even when responding to clearly provocative questions, the article noted. Perhaps most surprisingly, a clip of the exchange found its way into a sermon the following Sunday at a Manhattan church not far from The View's studio. We've all seen how discussions about faith usually go on TV, the pastor told his congregation. But here was something different. A man who didn't just talk about Jesus' teachings, but actually lived them in how he responded to criticism. That's the kind of witness that changes hearts. 3 days after the appearance, ratings reports confirmed that Jonathan's segment had been one of the most watched of the season for The View, with unusually high engagement across demographic groups. The show's producers, recognizing the audience response, began discussing the possibility of a series of conversations about faith that moved beyond the typical political framing to explore more meaningful questions. On social media, Jonathan maintained his usual humble presence, saying little about his appearance except to thank The View for the opportunity to discuss The Chosen and the themes it explored. His restraint stood in marked contrast to how many celebrities might have capitalized on such a viral moment, further reinforcing the authenticity that had made the exchange so powerful. A week after the appearance, a brief but noteworthy moment occurred on The View, when the hosts were discussing another topic related to religion in American life. Joy, about to make what sounded like the beginning of a dismissive comment about religious believers, paused and then noticeably reformulated her point in more nuanced terms. Sunny Hostin caught Sarah's eye across the table, both seemingly recognizing the subtle but significant shift. Behind the scenes, the show's executive producer had a conversation with the writing team about approaching faith-based topics with more depth and nuance. The audience response to the Roumie segment shows there's an appetite for substantive discussions of religion that go beyond the usual political divisions, she noted. Let's find more guests who can engage thoughtfully, rather than just scoring points. For Jonathan, the most meaningful responses came not from media coverage or industry recognition, but from individual messages that continued to arrive in the weeks following his appearance. "I've been angry at Christianity for years because of how some Christians treated me," one person wrote. "Your conversation on The View made me realize I've been judging Jesus by his followers' worst moments instead of by his actual teachings. I've started reading the Gospels again with fresh eyes." Another message came from a young actor struggling in his career. "I was ready to give up acting completely. Couldn't pay rent, couldn't get auditions, was working 3 side jobs just to eat. Watching you talk about your own rock bottom before The Chosen gave me hope that maybe I shouldn't quit just yet. Whether or not I ever make it, I'm trying to surrender my path the way you described." Perhaps the most unexpected response came 3 weeks after the appearance, when Jonathan received a brief message from a member of The View staff. "Just wanted you to know that Joy actually watched the first episode of The Chosen last weekend." The message read, "She'd never admit it publicly, but your conversation made her curious enough to check it out. She had some criticisms, of course, but she watched the whole thing. Small steps." The impact of that single television appearance continued to ripple outward in ways Jonathan could never have anticipated when he'd prayed in his hotel room that morning. A conversation that could have devolved into the typical pattern of provocation and defense had instead opened doors for genuine dialogue about faith, authenticity, and the timeless relevance of Jesus' teachings. At a fan event for The Chosen the following month, Jonathan was asked repeatedly about his appearance on The View and how he had maintained his composure despite Joy's challenging questions. I went into that interview having just played a scene where Jesus responds to criticism not with anger but with truth spoken in love, he explained to the audience. I guess some of that was still with me when I sat down on that set. He smiled thoughtfully before adding, "But the real answer is simpler. I've been on both sides of that conversation. I've been the skeptic with questions and criticisms about religion, and I've been the believer frustrated by those same questions." His honesty resonated with the crowd. Understanding both perspectives makes it easier to respond with empathy rather than defensiveness. Jonathan's experience on The View eventually became integrated into his broader speaking engagements about The Chosen and his personal faith journey. Rather than positioning it as a triumphant moment where he'd bested a critic, he consistently framed it as an opportunity to engage in meaningful dialogue across different worldviews. The kind of conversation sadly rare in an increasingly polarized media landscape. The most powerful thing about portraying Jesus, he often reflected in these talks, is being constantly immersed in his approach to people. How he saw beyond labels and categories, to the person underneath, how he responded to hostility with compassion instead of retaliation. He would pause thoughtfully before adding, "I fall short of that example every day, but it gives me a North Star to aim for in all my interactions." 6 months after the appearance, Jonathan returned to The View as part of the promotional tour for the newest season of The Chosen. The atmosphere was markedly different from his first visit. Less tension, more genuine curiosity from all the hosts, including Joy. Instead of trying to provoke a reaction, she asked thoughtful questions about how the show portrayed Jesus' interactions with women and marginalized groups. "I noticed that Jesus in your show treats women with unusual respect for that time period," Joy commented, her tone genuinely interested rather than challenging. Was that historically accurate or more of a modern interpretation? The question opened the door for a fascinating discussion about the radical nature of Jesus' approach to gender and social boundaries in his historical context. After the second appearance, Roumie made a point of speaking with Jonathan privately. "You changed something here," she told him with her characteristic directness. "Not just with the audience or with Joy, but with how we approach these conversations." She gestured toward the set they'd just left. "We have plenty of religious folks come on this show to promote their projects, but few who make us think about faith in a new way." What had begun as a potentially contentious interview had evolved into something much more significant. A model for how people of different beliefs might engage with one another in a media landscape often defined by shouting rather than listening. Without compromising his convictions, Jonathan had demonstrated that responding to skepticism with grace, rather than defensiveness, could open doors that argumentation never would. The story of Jonathan Roumie's appearance on The View eventually became something of a case study in media training sessions for people of faith preparing for mainstream interviews. Notice how he acknowledges the legitimate criticisms of religion instead of becoming defensive. Trainers would point out. He meets Joy where she is, instead of expecting her to come to his position first. Religious leaders particularly appreciated how Jonathan had maintained firm convictions while extending genuine respect to those who disagreed. He demonstrated what the Apostle Peter meant by giving an answer with gentleness and respect, one prominent pastor observed in a widely shared blog post. Not compromising truth, but presenting it in a way that invites rather than demands. For viewers accustomed to seeing faith discussed primarily through a political lens on daytime television, the unexpected depth and authenticity of the exchange provided a refreshing alternative. Comments on the official YouTube clip, which had garnered millions of views, reflected this impact. "I've never seen a conversation about faith on TV that didn't immediately devolve into left versus right politics. This was actually about something deeper." Jonathan himself remained characteristically humble about the impact of his appearance, continuing to focus on his work in The Chosen rather than drawing attention to the viral moment. When asked in subsequent interviews about the exchange with Joy, he consistently redirected the conversation to the show itself and its mission of portraying Jesus and his followers as relatable, three-dimensional people whose stories could resonate across cultural and religious divides. Dallas Jenkins, creator of The Chosen, reflected on how Jonathan's appearance had affected viewership in the weeks that followed. "We saw a significant spike in new viewers after that segment aired," he noted during a podcast interview. Many of them mentioned they'd never considered watching a faith-based show before, but Jonathan's thoughtful responses made them curious enough to give it a chance. Perhaps most remarkably, the segment sparked conversations in unexpected places about the possibility of discussing faith in public spaces without immediately falling into political categories or culture war positioning. Editorial pages in several major newspapers cited the exchange as an example of the kind of substantive dialogue often missing from contemporary media. A media analyst writing for a prominent online publication observed, "What made Roumie's appearance so compelling wasn't that he won the exchange, but that he refused to play by the usual rules that frame these discussions as debates with winners and losers." The article continued to explore how this approach might offer a template for more productive public conversations about deeply held beliefs. For many viewers of The Chosen, Jonathan's grace under pressure simply confirmed what they already appreciated about his portrayal of Jesus. The authentic compassion and wisdom that made his performance so compelling seemed to flow from similar qualities in the actor himself. Band messages frequently mentioned how the interview had deepened their appreciation of both his acting and his personal character. In Hollywood, an industry often skeptical of faith-based projects, the appearance generated a different kind of interest. The Chosen had already been breaking industry norms with its crowd-funded model and unprecedented global reach. But Jonathan's thoughtful engagement with challenging questions demonstrated that the show's appeal extended beyond traditional religious audiences. Several industry publications noted the unusual achievement of a faith-based series crossing over into mainstream cultural relevance without compromising its core message. Roumie's appearance on The View showcased exactly what makes The Chosen different, wrote one entertainment reporter. It presents faith not as a political identity, but as a profound human experience that can be discussed with both conviction and humility. At churches and faith communities around the country, the segment became a teaching moment about engaging with skepticism and criticism. Youth pastors and Bible study leaders used clips from the exchange to discuss how to give an answer for the hope within you with gentleness and respect, as the New Testament instructs. What Jonathan demonstrated wasn't just good media training. One Christian speaker explained to a conference of college students. It was an example of what Jesus meant when he told us to be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. Responding to challenging questions with both wisdom and genuine kindness, rather than defensiveness or counterattack. Joy Behar herself never publicly acknowledged any change of heart resulting from the exchange, maintaining her typically skeptical stance toward religion in subsequent discussions on the show. Yet observant viewers noticed subtle shifts in how she framed her questions about faith in the months that followed. Less dismissive mockery, more genuine curiosity about why people believed what they believed. During a later episode discussing a faith-related news story, Joy surprised her co-hosts by noting, "I still have my issues with organized religion, but I've been trying to distinguish between the problems with institutions and the genuine faith of individuals." Sunny and Whoopi exchanged a quick glance, both seemingly recognizing the influence of the conversation with Jonathan, even if Joy would never explicitly acknowledge it. For Jonathan, the most meaningful outcome wasn't the viral moment or industry recognition, but the individual stories that continued to reach him through social media and fan mail. "Your conversation with Joy made me reconsider why I walked away from faith years ago," one message read. "I realized I'd been rejecting a caricature of Jesus rather than the person I'm seeing portrayed in your show." Another wrote, "As someone who doesn't identify as religious, I always felt excluded from conversations about faith. Watching how you engaged with Joy's questions made me feel like maybe there's room for my doubts and questions too." These personal impacts meant far more to Jonathan than any temporary celebrity that came from the viral exchange. 6 months later, when Jonathan returned to The View to discuss the newest season of The Chosen, the entire atmosphere was noticeably different. The conversation flowed naturally between discussion of the show's production, the historical context of the biblical stories, and the universal themes that made these ancient narratives resonate with contemporary audiences. Even Joy's questions, while still direct, came from a place of genuine curiosity rather than dismissive skepticism. "I'm interested in how you portray Jesus' interactions with women," she commented during the second appearance. "It seems much more progressive than what we typically associate with religious traditions from that time period." Jonathan's thoughtful response opened up a fascinating discussion about the historical context of Jesus' ministry and his radical approach to gender and social boundaries. The gospel accounts show Jesus consistently elevating women in ways that were revolutionary for that cultural context, he explained. He had female disciples, spoke with women publicly when that was taboo, and first appeared after his resurrection to women, making them the first witnesses to the central event of Christianity. The conversation had evolved from confrontation to genuine dialogue, not because Jonathan had compromised his beliefs or Joy had abandoned her skepticism, but because both had found a way to engage across their differences with authentic respect. The audience responded with rapt attention, appreciating the rare opportunity to witness a nuanced discussion of faith on daytime television. After this second appearance, Jonathan received a brief, handwritten note from Joy herself, something she rarely did for guests on the show. "Thank you for your patience with my questions," it read simply. "You've given me some things to think about." The note contained no dramatic conversion story or wholesale change of perspective, but rather the simple acknowledgement that meaningful dialogue was possible across profound differences. The lasting impact of Jonathan's appearances extended beyond the specific conversations about The Chosen or his portrayal of Jesus. For many viewers, it provided a template for how people of faith might engage in the public square, not with defensive posturing or culture war rhetoric, but with gentle confidence and genuine respect for those who see the world differently. A media studies professor at a prestigious university incorporated the segment into her curriculum on religious representation in contemporary media. "What makes this exchange so unusual," she explained to her students, "is that it breaks nearly all our expectations for how these conversations typically unfold on television. Neither side is performing their expected role in the culture war narrative." At fan conventions and public appearances, Jonathan was often asked how he prepared for interviews like the one on The View, where his faith might be challenged. His answer remained consistent. "I don't prepare specific responses to potential criticisms. I try to prepare my heart to remember that every person, whether they share my beliefs or not, deserves to be heard and treated with dignity." This approach resonated deeply with fans of The Chosen, many of whom felt caught between their sincere faith and the often combative way religion was discussed in public forums. In Jonathan's example, they found a model for engaging with a skeptical world that maintained both conviction and compassion, standing firm in beliefs while extending genuine respect to those who disagreed. The show's unprecedented success, crossing cultural, demographic, and religious boundaries to become a global phenomenon, reflected this same approach. By portraying Jesus and his followers as fully human, with relatable struggles and authentic emotions, The Chosen invited viewers into the story, regardless of their prior relationship with faith. Jonathan's interactions with Joy Behar on The View had, in many ways, embodied the same spirit that made the show so compelling. Meeting people where they were without judgment, acknowledging legitimate questions and critiques, and extending grace even in the face of skepticism or mockery. It was an approach that reflected the Jesus he portrayed on screen. 3 years after that initial appearance, when The Chosen concluded its run after 7 successful seasons, Jonathan reflected on the journey in a heartfelt interview. "When I was broke and desperate before being cast, I never could have imagined how this role would transform not just my career, but my understanding of faith itself," he shared with genuine emotion. He continued thoughtfully. "Playing Jesus forces you to consider how he would respond in every situation, how he showed love to those who rejected him, how he responded to criticism without compromising truth, how he saw the humanity in everyone he encountered." This humility in his voice was evident as he added, "I'm still learning to live by that example, still failing and trying again every day." What had begun as a potentially contentious talk show segment had become part of a much larger story. Not just about an actor's career or a successful television series, but about the enduring power of responding to skepticism with grace, to mockery with compassion, and to cynicism with authentic hope. In a media landscape often defined by division and outrage, it offered a glimpse of a different possibility. As one commentator observed in a reflective piece about the show's cultural impact, "Perhaps the most remarkable achievement of The Chosen wasn't its technical innovations or crowdfunding success, but how it created space for conversations about faith that transcended the usual battle lines of the culture wars." Jonathan's appearance on The View had exemplified this achievement, demonstrating that even the most polarizing subjects could be discussed with both conviction and respect. For the millions who had followed Jonathan's journey from struggling actor to the face of a global phenomenon, his response to Joy Bihar's challenging questions represented something profound: the rare alignment of an actor's public persona with his private character, and the even rarer example of someone living the values he portrayed on screen. In an industry often characterized by artifice, his authentic faith had shone through not in grand statements or performances, but in the simple grace of meeting criticism with kindness. Years later, when asked about the most meaningful moments from his time on The Chosen, Jonathan would often mention not the dramatic scenes or critical acclaim, but the opportunities to embody the show's message of grace in real-world interactions, whether with skeptical talk show hosts, curious fans, or those who had been hurt by religious institutions. The greatest privilege, he would reflect with characteristic humility, wasn't portraying Jesus on screen, but finding small ways to reflect his compassion off-screen. The story of Jonathan Roumie's unexpected exchange with Joy Behar stands as a testament to the power of authentic faith, lived with both conviction and humility. A reminder that in a world where religious discussions often generate more heat than light, the most compelling witness isn't found in winning arguments, but in demonstrating grace. By responding to mockery not with defensiveness, but with thoughtful engagement, Jonathan had offered not just a memorable television moment, but a model of faith that transcended the boundaries of the screen to touch real lives and open genuine dialogue in a divided world. Have you ever witnessed someone respond to criticism or mockery with unexpected grace? How might our public conversations change if we approached disagreements with both conviction and compassion rather than seeking to win at all costs? Jonathan Roumie's example reminds us that sometimes the most powerful response to skepticism isn't a clever counterargument, but authentic kindness that creates space for genuine dialogue. Like, subscribe, and share if you believe in the transformative power of grace in our increasingly divided world.